Chapter 2. It had only been a few hours, but as the sun continued to bear down on Applejack and her companion, Rarity, it began to feel like days had gone by. How much could there possibly be of this confounded desert anyway? Upon realizing that the two of them were really stuck out here, all alone and with no idea of their location, the pair of ponies had decided to make for the mountains in the distance. Rarity had complained a bit at first, wanting instead to search for a town, but Applejack had explained. Getting onto a mountain, provided the caps weren't excessively high, would allow them to see the surrounding countryside with relative ease. From there it would be a simple downward trek to even ground, where they could begin the march to a city. Rarity had accepted the idea, impressed with the Earth Pony's grasp on the situation. "Applejack," she said, surprise in her voice, "wherever did you learn such, survival skills?" The Orange Earth Pony laughed, something she had not done in several hours. "They ain't fancy enough to be called that," she responded, winking. "It's just a couple of things I picked up from Big Mac when we used to get rowdy and run off." Rarity cocked an eyebrow. "Applejack," she said, "don't tell me you were a troublemaker when you were a filly." Applejack nodded, chuckling a little. "I sure was," she said, a dreamy look overcoming her eye. "You wouldn't think to look at us, the way Big Mac and I act now, responsible and all, but back then we caused poor Granny Smith grief to no end." Rarity seemed quite shocked. "Applejack, I find it very hard to believe. You're so dutiful most of the time that I can't even imagine you being hyper and getting into trouble." Applejack raised a hoof, pushing a few strands of loose hair back under the brim of her hat. "Believe it," she said, lip curling back into a smirk. "But it's not like we was trying to be bad. We were just curious, so we'd run off without permission and get into trouble." Rarity giggled, not even noticing the desert around her anymore. "That sounds a lot like me, actually," she said, and when Applejack balked, she elaborated. "You see, I was a very curious child myself, and whenever the opportunity to make a new dress or design something for another pony arose, I was always eager to assist them, usually in ways which, to say the least, angered my parents." Beg pardon, Rarity," said Applejack, "but what sort of assistance did you give these ponies exactly?" Rarity blushed, shaking her head. "Oh, I would do foolish little things, using Father's dyes, he was a tailor by trade, you see, to recolor other fillies' dresses, using his sewing needles to craft new wardrobe for friends of mine." She paused for a moment, letting the information sink in. "They were never all that wonderful, really, patchwork designs, and I can't count how many times my hair ended up bright red." She smiled sheepishly. "You know, little things." Applejack found herself laughing at Rarity's story. This prim and proper mare used to get dirty with dyes? She used to make patchwork outfits and get her parents mad? The whole idea of it threw Applejack for a loop. "Well, shoot, Rarity," she said. "I guess there is a fun pony in there somewhere." Rarity scowled, but a smile quickly overtook that, and she giggled. "Applejack, you give me too little credit. I've been known to cut loose every now and again." She shook her head. "Though, admittedly, I do it much less often these days. I have responsibilities to my clients, and you all as well. I have to fulfill those expectations in order to keep my business and keep my friends." Applejack was beginning to tire of being serious. The situation they were in was serious enough without talking about such things. "Would you like to hear a story about me and Big Mac when we was just kids? I got a million of 'em." Rarity nodded with genuine interest. "Well, first thing that comes to mind is the time me and Mac decided to see what the Everfree Forest was really like. We heard all kinds of rumors about the place, and eventually curiosity got the better of us." Applejack chuckled, not noticing that the mountains were closer than ever now. "See, the weather ponies were just starting up a big storm when we went to the woods. We figured Granny'd think we were out playing in the mud or something. We used to do that a lot." "Applejack," Rarity said, "you went out to the Everfree Forest? Alone?" The orange mare nodded. "Why, I can't even imagine such a thing. It's so dark and frightening. Weren't you scared?" Applejack chuckled as a plume of dust welled from the cracked desert floor, collecting along the brim of her hat. "Well, sure we was," she replied, "but we were too curious to just quit right there and then. Me a little more so than Big Macintosh. He came along with me, and sure he was wanting to find out and all, but I think he was just keeping an eye on me, making sure I actually came home at the end of the day." Rarity nodded. "Sweetie Belle may be much younger than me, but I've watched out for her in the same way for a number of years now. In any case, what did you find, Applejack?" Applejack shook her head. Nothing interesting, really. Big Mac and me got all excited about going into the forbidden everfree forest, and all we found was a bunch of trees and a couple of plants we'd never seen before. Of course, that was only our first time going into the forest. Turned out to be so boring that we went back in a few more times trying to see if there was actually anything neat in there. A tumbleweed rolled past the pair, coming to rest against a cactus. Rarity found that, as she listened, Applejack became more endearing to her. Not only were her stories killing time in this horrible desert, but they were actually entertaining. She wasn't sure how long this newfound truce would last, but for the moment she was enjoying it. She never liked fighting with Applejack, but they butted heads so much that it seemed like fighting was all they did sometimes. They'd learned from each other over the past year, but they were still stubborn about the way things should be. "Well," she asked, "did you and Big Macintosh discover anything more interesting on your other trips?" "Sure did," Applejack replied. "When we started going back, we found all kinds of stuff. Big bird's nest, caves with all kinds of neat rocks in 'em, and one time we went out and found a big bed of poison joke. Oh, that was a funny one. Big Mac started touching 'em even when I told him not to, and he came back to the farm acting riled up and mad as all get out. Whoo, boy, I never heard such language. Granny Smith ended up grounding him for it." Rarity giggled, but cleared her throat and spoke up. "Applejack, dear," she said, "excuse me for asking, but why didn't you recognize the poison joke when all of us were affected by it? After all, you must have seen it before, considering your brother was affected by it so profoundly." Applejack nodded. "You'd think so," she said, "but it'd been a long time since I'd seen it, and my memory isn't really all that great. When I heard the name, I kinda remembered what it was, but I wasn't sure whether it was the same type of plant messed up my brother's attitude so much." Rarity nodded. "That's understandable, I suppose," she said, smiling. "I'm just glad we were able to get out of that situation with our pride intact. My hair looked so awful." Applejack snorted good-naturedly. "Says you," she said. "All you had to deal with was a bad hair day. I got shrunk down to the size of a pea. If I recall correctly, you all thought one of you'd sat on me. Now, it would have been a pretty embarrassing way to go, I tell ya." The orange mare paused a moment, then shuddered. "Not to mention some of the other things that happened. I can still remember the way Apple Bloom looked down on me, like she was fixin' to crush me under hoof or something." Applejack chuckled. "And I still remember having to shake Dash's spit out of my coat. Yuck!" The earth pony stuck her tongue out. Rarity let out a small giggle. "Applejack, we've only known each other for a year, and the things we've done—" She smiled, a dreamy look coming over her. "I swear we could write a novel all about it. Fate seems to have a way of throwing us into these situations, does it not?" When Applejack raised an eyebrow, Rarity elaborated. "Well, what I mean is that you don't hear about many ponies dealing with the sorts of things we have, you know? Sure, Berry Punch and her filly may throw a botched birthday party, or Lyra and Bonbon may get into a fight, but we're truly the ones with the stories to tell at the end of the day." "I think I see what you mean," Applejack agreed. Then suddenly she stopped. "But, I think storytelling can wait till a little later." Her eyes were forward and seemed to be full of wonderment. Rarity was confused. "Why is that, darling?" she asked, looking forward as well. "I don't see why, oh my." She trailed off, raising a hoof to push a lock of hair from her eye for a better view. Before the pair of ponies was a sight one could only describe as hauntingly beautiful. It seemed that, caught up in their talking, neither pony had noticed the change in scenery from a harsh, dusty desert through a small cove of trees into a sparkling, misted valley. This could only be the entrance point for the line of mountains they'd seen earlier. The first leg of their journey, it seemed, was already over. There were high walls of rock flanking them, and the nature-carved stone glittered and glistened with the light veil of dew as the sun, muffled by the clouds of mist blanketing the quiet little area, touched gently along it, shining through the drops of water to turn them into beaming pearls, multifaceted rubies, and twinkling sapphires. Below their hooves, the grass held these wondrous natural jewels as well, the green strands coated from stem to root with a mystical dew. In the distance they could hear bird songs, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, and even bits of the mountain breaking off to skip down the jagged, ancient cliffs, clacking to the ground below. All the sounds were coming together, bouncing back and forth like a ball propelled by an overexcited foal between the thick rock walls. Through the mist, Rarity and Applejack could see trees lining either side of the valley, creating a path inward and upward, the ground abruptly sloping up, signaling a climb into the time-worn paths of the mountain proper. Small animals, squirrels and the like, scampered about in the trees, looking for food, or perhaps shelter against the humid environment the sun was creating as it cut holes in the fog. "It's amazing," Rarity said, breathless at the spectacle. "I've never seen anything like it, even around the most prestigious high-class gardens of Canterlot." Applejack nodded in agreement, a gentle smile coming across her features. "It really is something to see, ain't it?" She scraped her hooves on the ground, thickening the air with light clouds of dust. "I remember seeing something like it once before, actually, during one of me and Big Mac's trips to the Everfree Forest. We was looking for somewhere to sit down for a bit, and it started raining, and the rain ended up making the whole forest foggy. It was amazing." Rarity nodded dumbly, the sparkling dew and mist reflecting in her eyes, making them glitter like sapphires. "It's unlike anything," she said. Applejack chuckled. "Nothing like it anywhere," she said. "That's what makes seeing it so great." A bank of dark clouds loomed in the distance over the mountain tops, the first sign of a storm. The earth pony shook her head and tapped Rarity with her hoof. "Hey, we probably ought to get going soon, Sugar Cube. If we stay here too long, it's likely we're going to get soaked." Rarity inhaled slowly and let out a dreamy sigh, nodding. "I suppose so," she said. "It wouldn't do for us to be caught out in the elements with no protection, especially as bad as that storm looks. The weather ponies in this region must need quite a downpour to make up for something." Applejack shook her head. "I don't think it's weather ponies," she said. "Mountains like this usually ain't got ponies around. I've heard ponies saying that in places like this, weather just kinda happens." Rarity began walking forward at this point, and Applejack kept up with her, their hooves kicking small showers of cool water. "Just happens?" Rarity asked. "How could that be? Weather isn't stable or useful unless weather ponies are controlling it." Applejack shrugged. "I'm just telling you what I heard," she said. "Can't tell you whether it's true or not. Maybe there are some weather ponies up in these mountains. There's no telling till we get up there, so I say we pick up the pace." A howling wind ripped through the stillness, and Applejack started walking faster. "Before that falls on top of us, I'm willing to bet there's a forest, or at least another bank of trees up ahead. The one flanking us go further up." Rarity bit her lip. "Applejack," she said, "are you sure about that? What if we get all the way up the mountain and, well, there's nothing?" Applejack rolled her eyes. "You're thinking too far ahead, Sugar Cube," she said. "We just gotta get up this hill and see what's up there. Then we can worry about how the rest of the mountain is." Rarity still felt hesitant, but nodded, placing her hooves down on the curve of the hill. "I'll follow your lead then, dear," she said, trying to sound confident. The grass was slick with dew, and it was hard to find purchase anywhere on the hillside, like trying to walk on water. The slope was also much steeper up close than it had looked far away. The hill was lying at a 45-degree angle. Applejack wasn't having much luck, but she was able to slowly begin ascending the mound. "Watch your step, Rarity," the earth pony said. "I wouldn't want you to take a spill or anything." Rarity smiled and nodded. "Don't worry about me, Applejack," she called, her tone cheerful. "I feel right as rain on this slope. Nothing to worry about." She was lying, of course, and as she used a small bank of rocks as hoof-holds, she couldn't help but think of how difficult this climb would be. She could get very messy if she wasn't careful, and that just wouldn't do. Applejack felt her hooves trying to slip. The loose plants or rocks provided few hoof-holds. Her chin kept impacting the grass and rocks as she fell over again and again. The earth pony, strong as she was, found the climb extremely hard, more so because of the slippery dew beneath her hooves. Even so, with a dark bruise forming under her chin, she was making slow progress, about halfway up, and that was what mattered. Rarity, on the other hand, was growing more distressed by the moment. Applejack was getting further away, while she seemed to stay in the same spot. The white hair around her hoofs was now stained a bright green, and she squeaked in disapproval. But if she fell behind now, she'd get separated from Applejack and swept up by the storm. Her muscles ached. She was using all her strength to avoid slipping, but any rest could cause her to go careening down again. She was a quarter of the way up. No stopping now. Applejack saw that Rarity was lagging behind. She was laboring to get up the hillside, her eyes shut tight as she strained and puffed, sparks of stress flitting from her horn. "You all right down there, Rarity?" she called, stopping briefly. "You need me to wait on you a bit?" Rarity knew Applejack wasn't trying to be inflammatory, but the comment still stung, and she responded, "No, Applejack, I'm perfectly fine, but thank you." It was a lie, but the unicorn was blinded by her pride. She didn't want to appear weak in front of Applejack, especially not after what had happened at the first sleepover of Twilight's. Rarity struggled along, forcing herself to continue despite the increasing amount of mud as she scaled further up. Applejack was now near the crest of the hill. This area was much rockier, and she had to take extra care. Her hooves made small squelching noises as she advanced up the soft ground. The rocks, unless they were flat or grouped together, were the worst. There was no way to get any traction, and slipping meant another bruise to add to the collection. But Applejack could see she was nearly there, and not a moment too soon. The wind was picking up. "Rarity!" Applejack yelled, her hoofs coming up over the crest, where she could dig them in. "Hurry! It's not going to be much longer before the storm's on top of us." Rarity was only 3/5 of the way up, her shoulders and flanks bruised, as did her lungs. Her breaths were coming short, her lungs squished against the hillside. A gust of wind shot forth, sending the unicorn's hair flying all about, and threatening to blow her straight down. Rarity dug her hooves in, gritting her teeth and shutting her eyes. "Come on, Rarity," Applejack hollered. "You can't give up now. Come on, get up here." The wind was whipping around, and the earth pony had to hold her hat as she reached the crest, hauling herself up with a sigh of relief. She was worried for Rarity, though. If she wasn't able to make it up the hill, they'd be separated, and that might get one of them killed in this unfamiliar territory. "I hear you, Applejack," Rarity screamed, wrenching her hoof into a collection of rocks so as to haul herself onto the final curve. It wasn't a question of whether she could do it or not. At this point, it was that she simply had to. Her hooves were becoming inflamed and nicked, but she pressed on. Finally, as the first few drops of rain splashed down into the grass, Rarity crested the hill, digging her hooves into the side. "There, see, Applejack," she said, smiling. "I'm perfectly fine. Now let me just— ah!" As Rarity spoke, she tried to find a hoof hold and pull herself up, but her pained hooves clonked off a rock, causing Rarity to lose her balance and slip, crying out as she flipped head over heels. Applejack acted fast. She dove forward, the air knocked out of her as she collided with the curve of the hill. Winded, she reached out with her hooves, snatching Rarity by her back legs. The unicorn gave a cry of pain as the strained ligaments and muscles stretched out fully. "Sorry, Sugar Cube," Applejack said, "but you'll thank me later." "I promise." With that, she pulled on Rarity's legs, dragging the pony back up the hillside. When Rarity flopped onto the ground, her white coat was now patched with grass stains. "Sorry, Sugar Cube," Applejack said, "but you'll thank me for this later, I promise." With that, she pulled on Rarity's legs, dragging the pony back up the hillside. When Rarity flopped onto level ground, her white coat now patchy with grass stains, Applejack whirled about, looking behind them. Sure enough, there seemed to be a good-sized bank of trees ahead. Applejack tapped Rarity's stomach to get her attention. "Rarity, get up, please," she said. "We can take cover under those trees over there." The tap made Rarity jump, and spread prickly heat throughout her stomach, which made her shudder as she righted herself. "Sorry," she said, trotting with her friend into the forest ahead. The ponies walked for about an hour, huddled under the trees, tired and unhappy, before they decided it was bedtime. The ground had muddied fast, and Rarity flat out refused to lay in the thick filth. "I will do no such thing," she cried, "especially not with so many usable materials around to make a bed." It seemed that, despite the exhausting climb up the hill, Rarity was still very much Rarity. "Usable materials?" Applejack replied. "Rarity, we're in a dang forest. What the hell are you going to use to make a bed out here?" Rarity giggled, her horn lighting up as she dragged a few leaves from the trees. "Applejack, when you have the eye of a designer, all materials are usable. Perhaps there are no goose feathers or any such things here, but give me 30 minutes and we will have ourselves a pair of beds." She smiled, but it faded into a glower when a wayward drop of rain plucked onto her nose. Rarity wasted no time getting to work. She tore leaf after leaf from the surrounding trees, arranging them in layers on the muddy ground. They were flimsy and would sink a little into the mud, but they were better than nothing. When they were all arranged, the unicorn slipped a few layers of moss and lichen in between the layers of leaves to provide padding. She had to hold the bed in place magically, as there was nothing to anchor it, and the wind was still high. The fashionista tore more moss from the trees, all of it coming together on top of the bed to form a grassy blanket. "Shoot, Rarity," Applejack said, whistling. "Sure do know how to put something together." Rarity giggled, nodding at the bed. "I've read about this sort of thing somewhere before. I believe it was in a magazine, an issue on home couture, where nature was a necessary element. These beds are standard, though they are normally sewn together, you see. Rarity was quite proud of herself for remembering the design off the top of her head. Go ahead, lie down. I'll get started on mine. Applejack did just that, getting under the mossy blanket and hooking her hooves around to hold it together and keep herself warm. The Earth Pony gave a small moan of happiness. This feels amazing, Rarity, she said. It ain't a real bed, but boy does it feel good after that climb. Rarity smiled. I'm glad you like it, Applejack, she replied. These should serve us well tonight. Her own bed was nearly finished, and she went silent for the final touches. When she was done, she kept her back to her friend. Applejack, well, sorry about what happened at Twilight's house earlier. I acted rather silly, and it was wrong of me. She waited a moment, but no reply. AJ dear, if you're still angry, please tell me. I'd rather not be left in the dark. When still no answer came, Rarity glared at her, eyes twitching with rage as she spun around. Applejack! She shouted. I can't believe you would be so rude as to... Rarity trailed off when she saw that Applejack had fallen asleep, her chest slowly falling and rising. Rarity let a smile spread across her face, her eyes softening greatly. Applejack had worked herself harder than she'd let on. The white unicorn lay down on her own bed, snuggling into the moss. The cozy, earthy smell was quite soothing, and she could feel her knotted muscles relaxing. It hardly took any time at all for her to fall asleep. Her breath